podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
2 questions today, one about baptism and another about Supralapsarianism.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
If you're just finding the Heidelcast, you should subscribe in any podcast app. If you're using Apple, which most listeners do, you just hit follow and then bang, we'll be right there in your app when you look at it, and you'll get 4 episodes, Lord permitting, each week, and all free to you. And then you should also go to heidelblog.net and type in your email address, and that way you'll subscribe to our daily newsletter. Again, that's free, and we give you a little notice. Here, this is what's on the Heidelblog today. And then you can kind of get an overview and click on the articles. So if you do that, you won't miss anything of the good stuff that we are sending out.
Well, let's read some emails, shall we?
Okay, let's do that. I pulled a couple of emails out of the coffer. The first one's from Martin, and he says, "Hello, Dr. Clark." Well, hello, Martin. I listened to your episode with Keith Foskey on his channel. Yeah, a while back I did an interview that should show up at some point on the Heidelblog, in case you missed that. Your Reformed podcast, I think. We talked about the language of Reformed Baptist. And I mentioned in the episode that the earliest I had found the expression Reformed Baptist was in the 1980s. No, that's not quite accurate. The earliest I found, and that I recorded in a academic article in a collection of essays published as, hang on, I'll get it here. I'll get the title right. On Being Reformed is the name of the volume. Let me put it back now because I've got no place to put it on my desk here. All the equipment and paper and stuff. Anyway, so what I said in that article, and what I tried to say in the podcast, what I meant to say, maybe I misspoke, is that the earliest reference I found is 1823, and I didn't find it. As I say, somebody found it for me. But it was the case that if you look at Google Ngram, which is what I've done, you can do this, N-G-R-A-M, Google Ngram, and you can search for the phrase Reformed Baptist, put that in quotation marks. You'll see a bunch of results in the 19th century, but if you look them up, and I did, you'll see they're not actually using the expression Reformed Baptist. So that's somewhat misleading. But in the way that we are using the expression now, and together, the two words together as, Reformed as a qualifier, a Baptist, it really begins in the 1990s, that is, and it peaks around 2000. So there's a strong correlation with the rise of the young, restless, and Reformed movement, the widespread use of that nomenclature. But it's not language that one finds in the 17th century. Somebody did recently point me to some usage where there's a Baptist writer describing himself as Reformed. I don't think he used the expression Reformed Baptist, which would then, I guess, still confirm my point, but that he certainly was identifying with the Reformed, and that would have been, I think, if memory serves, in the early 18th century. But so far, I have not found 17th century particular Baptists describing themselves as Reformed. So that was the point that I was making there. And then he says 1983. Again, that was 1823 is what somebody sent that to me. So maybe there's a typo in the article we need to correct. So if so, that's my fault, our fault. We need to fix that. And then he says, quoting here, "And yet in the opening paragraph, you mentioned that the earliest examples occurred in 1680. Well, I didn't actually, because I pulled up the article, and I'm not actually saying that anyone was calling themselves Reformed Baptist in 1680. So this is a reference to an article I published in July of 2022, the title of which is "There is no Credo Baptist Heidelberg Catechism," or why Hercules Collins was not reformed. And then I walk through the problem of squatters, which is something that I've discussed before on the Heidel blog and something that Keith Foskey and I discussed. And then I walk through a couple of issues, and then I discuss the background of Hercules Collins' 1680, or around that time, revision of the Heidelberg Catechism, and he published it as an Orthodox Catechism. And obviously makes some fairly significant changes to the Heidelberg Catechism, which, so the actual Heidelberg Catechism says in question 74, are infants also to be baptized? And we said yes, for they belong to the covenant and people of God as well as their parents. And since redemption from sin through the blood of Christ and the Holy Spirit who works faith are promised to them no less than to their parents. It's because we're Abrahamic, right? That's the Abrahamic paradigm. I will be a God to you and to your children after you. And then the Reformed churches continue by saying they are also by baptism as the sign of the covenant to be engrafted into the Christian church and distinguished from the children of unbelievers, as was done in the Old Testament by circumcision, in place of which in the New Testament baptism is instituted. And they go through to highlight a number of significant differences with the version of the Heidelberg Catechism published by Hercules Collins. He doesn't call it the Heidelberg, but he calls it the Orthodox Catechism, but it's the Heidelberg that he's revising. And somebody published it more recently as the Heidelberg Catechism, a Credo Baptist edition.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
Hence the title of the article. There is no such thing as a Credo Baptist Heidelberg Catechism. That's a contradiction in terms. And then I'm complaining about the Baptist appropriation of our stuff. The word Reformed and our theology, piety, and practice, and then implicit in that appropriation is an attempt to redefine it. So Martin is concerned that I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not, because he's, I think, seeing things in the article that I wrote that I didn't say. Now, I did use the language Reformed Baptist. So Martin's email here is a good prompt to go back and revise that and clean that up and make that a little clearer. But Hercules Collins, to the best of my knowledge, did not describe himself as a Reformed Baptist because, as I keep saying, the early particular Baptists knew better. They knew that they were not Reformed. They identified with aspects of Reformed theology, but that they fundamentally disagreed with us on the nature of the history of redemption, the nature of the unity of the covenant of grace, on the nature of the visible church, and those sorts of things, all of which we take as being pretty important. And of course, the Baptists on their own terms take their own convictions on those things as being quite important. And so, as I keep saying, just as we can't properly, intelligently call ourselves Baptists, even though we baptize hitherto unbaptized adults, Baptists can't reasonably, intelligently call themselves Reformed because the differences are just, too significant.
This is the Heidelcast. Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
All right, and this gets me to the second of our emails.
You got some letters.
Thank you, Mick. I need my glasses for this one. I can't. Hang on here. Stand by while we make some technical adjustments. Here we go. This one is from Jared, who says, "Hey, Dr. Clark, Jared here. Hope you're well." Well, thank you. I am. I was trying to find information on Supralapsarian Christology. Let me spell that word for you in case that's new to you. Supra, S-U-P-R-A, Lapsarian, L-A-P-S-A-R-I-A-N. So that's supra, not super, but Supralapsarian Christology, and was hoping that you could answer the question, quote, "Would the Son have become incarnate even without the fall?" Close quote. You have a blog post from 2008 and wants to know if 16 years later would be a good time to address it again, as I've seen Supralapsarianism becoming popular with young Reformed people online. All right, well, that's interesting. I think I know where this question comes from. There is a fellow with a social media presence called Reformed Zoomer, and I know him. I don't know who he is in real life, but we do DM some, and he's, I think, shown himself to be somewhat teachable, but he's a mainline guy. He's in the PCUSA, and he's hoping to lead a renaissance of the mainline churches and so forth. And we've talked about that on other episodes, and he recently made some, I think, and I told him this privately, and I think he agrees with me now, some unguarded and not very well-informed pronouncements about Duns Scotus, who's the most complicated medieval theologian in the West, I think, in my view. I enjoy our medieval seminar that I teach, but when it comes to Scotus Week, which is, as I'm recording this, is Thursday, I don't really look forward to that because Scotus is so difficult, but it's interesting, and the students seem to enjoy it. So anyway, Scotus theorized that God the Son would become incarnate even had the fall not happened, on the theory that the only way we could ever be united to God was through the incarnation. And so he disconnected the incarnation from the fall. And that's just nothing but sheer speculation. There just isn't any biblical basis for what Scotus said. And that's why in Heidelberg Catechism, question 6, we say, did God create man thus wicked and perverse? No, but God created man good and after his own image, that is, in righteousness and true holiness, that he might rightly know God his creator, heartily love him, and live with him in eternal blessedness to praise and glorify him. So, the implication being there, had Adam obeyed, had he, as we say in the Belgic Confession, obeyed the commandment of life, or as we said in later Reformed theology, had he met the terms of the covenant of works or the covenant of life or the covenant of nature, all different ways of talking about the same thing, right? Had he done that, he would have entered into eternal blessedness. And so, no, the incarnation is not built in, as it were. And again, Heidelberg 9 speaks to this. Does not God then do injustice to man by requiring of him in his law that which he cannot perform? And the answer is no, for God made man that he could perform it. But man, through the instigation of the devil by willful disobedience, deprived himself and all his descendants of this power. So the standard of entering into eternal and blessed fellowship with God was obedience to his law. And so the implication being, again, that he would have entered into that blessedness. So, it's fine, I guess, for people to say what they will on social media, but we ought not to be taking people, frankly, who don't know anything. I don't mean to be too harsh, but, in this case, this young man, this Zoomer, so to say you're a Zoomer is to say that you're, well younger than a Boomer, younger than a Gen X person, younger than a millennial. So you're quite young. And so it's, why are we taking a person who, hasn't formal theological education and who is obviously very young, very enthusiastic, but these are very difficult questions. And why are we taking this seriously? So just, people can say what they want. And as I try to remind, my kids and my students, anybody, as I've been proving for, as Jared is sort of reminding me here, been doing this for a long time, anybody can say anything online, and they do. But that doesn't mean that we have to take it seriously, whether it's conspiracy theories or theological proclamations because somebody read something on the internet or something. I don't even know that that people who are talking about all this stuff have ever sat down to read Scotus. I think if they had actually sat down to read Scotus, they probably wouldn't be making proclamations. They'd be thankful for people like Richard Cross and others who have helped us to understand them, but they would be chastened because Scotus will give you a workout. And as to the premise of his question, that this is somehow connected to supralapsarianism, well, I don't know that to be the case at all. So I don't know exactly from where that question comes.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
Very quickly, the distinction between supra and infra is this. This is not a temporal or a chronological distinction. It's a logical distinction. And what it means is this. When God thinks about the fall, does he he think of us as having been created and having fallen, and then out of the fallen mass, that he elects some and allows others to remain in their fallen state? That would be roughly the infralapsarian way of thinking about the fallen. That's the way that most Reformed people have done. That's the way the confessions seem to talk. That's the way the Westminster Standards talk. That's the way the canons of Dort talk. That's the way I try to talk. I think the infralapsarian explanation fits Scripture better. And then there is the supralapsarian approach, which in very broad terms says that God considers humanity not as created, but as possible, as potential. And then out of this mass of potentials, if you will, he swipes right and swipes left. In other words, you possibilities, they're not even considered as created. They're not considered as fallen. They're just considered as potentials. So some potentials are decreed from all eternity to be elect, and some potentials are decreed from all eternity to be reprobate and without regard to sin. And so that, in very broad terms, that's the supralapsarian view. Now, if you look at the history of the debate, and it's a good question where to look at the history of the debate. Most of what I know about the debate I've learned probably from reading Richard Muller, picking up bits and pieces, but I have never done any serious reading on the history of the debate. But I do know enough to say that as the debate progressed, the infras ended up sounding a little bit like the supras, and the supras ended up sounding a little bit like the infras. When I was in seminary, the pretty clear implication was that this was not a very fruitful discussion, and we were sort of encouraged just to ignore it and not to get into it. But over the years, as I've tried to engage the tradition, I've had to learn a little bit about it so that I can understand some of the things that are being said, some of the points that were being made. And I think I have found it useful to be able to explain the confessions, particularly to make a basic distinction between the supras and the infras. So I would not like to see a resurgence of supralapsarianism. I don't think it's as well grounded in the tradition, and I don't think it's as well grounded in the Reformed confessions.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.